The relationship between parents and children can be a beautiful thing. A connection that for some is not only unbreakable, but full of love, trust, and understanding. For some, there is a wealth of knowledge, help, and acceptance only a single phone call away. A built-in safety net, ready and waiting to catch them if they fall. But for others, the offspring-progenitor relationship is less than perfect. Many people find themselves ignored or unacknowledged, a burden on the lives of those who created them, pushed aside even for better or more important things. They feel alone, staring through well-lit windows, watching from the outside as families eat together, work together, and play together. Just wishing that they could experience the warmth, the affirmation, and the love. They just wish for something normal. Our antagonist this week was not on the outside looking in, wasn't one of those who by chance or cruel fate was born into a family who didn't want him. In fact, by all accounts, the family he came from was, quote, normal, unquote. A family that wanted him, cared for him, and loved him. But, in the end, it just wasn't enough. No matter how much he had, he always wanted more. And he knew exactly how to get it. So, join me this week as we learn about the tale of a boy who tried to take what was most likely going to be given to him freely. This week we tell the tale of Andrew Wamsley. As always, I'm Chase Ellerman, and this is Almost Fiction. Chapter 1. Rick and Susie Wamsley were known around town as good people. Whenever the couple heard about someone in their circle who was in need, they were always right there to help. In fact, Suzanna, or Susie Wamsley, had recently gone out of her way to buy towels for a family friend who was soon going to be moving into an assisted living facility. She just wanted to get them something to brighten up their bathroom. Then there was Rick, her husband, who, foregoing a good night of sleep, had just given a ride home to someone after they found themselves in the ER after a minor car accident in the middle of the night. They just liked helping people, always looking for ways to serve their neighbors no matter what their needs might have been. The Wamsleys lived a pretty prototypical and generic American life. Rick, an athlete in high school, met his sweetheart Suzanna, or Susie, before they both went to college, him at Oklahoma State University and her at Oklahoma Christian College, where Rick was studying to become an accountant and Susie was pursuing a degree in art. 2 years into their college careers, in 1978, the two got married, and a year later, in 1979, on Valentine's Day, the two welcomed their first child into the world, Sarah. Then, 5 years later, on July 7th, 1984, they would have another child, this time a son they named Andrew. After Rick received his CPA license, he found employment for a number of oil companies, first in Houston, Texas, then Salt Lake City, Utah, and finally Dallas, Texas. 1995 saw the Wamsleys purchase their large 2-story home on Turnberry Drive in the Walnut Estates neighborhood. Not wanting to live in Dallas proper, they had decided to live nearby in the small but quickly growing city of Mansfield. It was the place to be. But no matter where Rick's job took the family, they always made time for their 2 kids and tried their best to create a loving and stable home. Rick was eventually able to find a job that let him work from home, something he had always wanted because it gave him more free time and opportunity to let him do what he loved, which was work on his perfect yard. Rick spent many hours planning and building his yard, installing a flagstone patio and even a fountain, which he built himself. It seemed like their life was almost perfect. The job, the house, the kids, everything anyone could ever want. The Wamsleys' life seemed like something straight out of a 90s sitcom. Football games on Friday nights, the entire family showing up to cheer on Sarah as she waved her pom-poms on the sidelines. Sleepovers, video games, and pizza parties on Saturdays with Andrew's friends showing up to the smells of freshly baked brownies. Sundays were full of family and fishing, Sarah and Andrew often spending hours laughing and talking together, always seeming to get along. Then there were the baseball games. They spent many a sunny afternoon together watching the Texas Rangers play from Rick's company seats at the ballpark in Arlington. They even bought Andrew a white Mustang, happily making the payments as long as he kept his grades up, which he did. It seemed like life just couldn't get any better. Chapter 2, December 11th, 2003. Patty Clark drove by the Wamsleys' house on her way home at around 9 p.m., but something was wrong. The lights that usually lit up the Wamsleys' home weren't on. Maybe Rick and Susie had gone out and forgot to turn the lights on, or maybe they just weren't home yet. Putting the worry out of her mind, Patty continued on with her evening. A few hours later, there was a knock on Patty's door. Wondering what her late-night visitor might have for her, Patty opens the door to find one of her son's best friends. Quote, "What's going on next door?" Unquote. Patty peeks out to see police cars parked out in front of the Wamsley home, lights blazing. Hoping to find out that her friends are all okay, Patty approaches the officers only to learn that her friends Rick and Susie had been murdered. 11:40 p.m. A call is placed to 911, but when dispatchers attempt to talk to the caller, they are met with silence. Unable to get anyone to respond, police are sent to the address associated with the number. Upon arriving, they knock on the front door, but there's no response. They then begin to circle the house and find an open garage door, which they enter. The door leading from the garage to the home is also open. As they walk through the house, calling out, seeking any signs of life, they find a woman lying on the living room couch. They go to the woman's side, concerned that she has not yet responded to their continued shouts, only to find that the motionless woman was deceased. A gunshot wound from what appeared to be a large caliber weapon had mangled her left ear and other parts of her head and face. She had also been stabbed 18 times around her chest and neck. Next, police found Rick. Like his wife, he had also been shot in the head as well as his back and had been stabbed 21 times. The knife used was laying next to him. The blade was broken from how vicious the attack had been. Realizing that they were now in the middle of an active crime scene, officers began to take the rest of the room in, noting what they saw. 2 different sets of bloody shoe prints ran across the carpet in the living room, as well as the dining room and the front door entryway. There were no large amounts of damage, no sign of forced entry, and none of the higher-priced items left in the room had been disturbed. Detectives were brought in, and the investigation officially began. Looking at the scene more closely, They were able to recover a few casings and even some bullets from behind holes they left in walls. They also discovered approximately $15,000 distributed about the master bedroom that had not been taken. With robbery apparently out as a motive, they were left with the questions of who could have done this and why. They began to try and speculate. Chapter 3. IHOP, the International House of Pancakes. The teenagers had been showing up for a while now. He didn't know why they chose his location, behind the parks at Arlington Mall, but whenever they showed up, they always requested one of the larger booths and then would spend the next 5 or 6 hours drinking Dr. Pepper and playing cards. As the night manager, Hilario Cardenas, would usually check on the kids, making sure they were behaving and not giving any of his staff a hard time, but as long as they didn't bother anyone, he didn't mind having them there. They'd usually show up at around 11, order a few things, and then break out the cards. At first, he didn't know what Yu-Gi-Oh was, but he soon learned all about the Japanese card game that was in some ways similar to Magic the Gathering, but aimed at a younger audience. The kids played and played and played, passing the late night hours away, usually only leaving when the sun was coming up. Eventually, he learned their names and even became friends with the group, especially Chelsea Richardson, Susanna Toledano, and Andrew Wamsley. The more time he spent at their table, the more and more he started to like them. Yeah, they were weird, a bit different, but they were fun. Chelsea Richardson was a student at Joe C. Bean High School. To those that knew her, she was described as a bright, bubbly blonde who loved to laugh. Chelsea had started going to the IHOP to play Yu-Gi-Oh with her brother in late 2002 during the middle of her senior year. That's where she had met Andrew. The recently graduated boy was cute and he was into Yu-Gi-Oh cards like her and her brother, and she was pretty sure that his family had at least a little bit of money. Unlike Andrew, who lived in an affluent suburb, the Richardson family lived in nearby blue-collar Everman, Texas, in a run-down tract home. Just 3 years before, their father, Thaddeus Tank Richardson, had passed away, leaving his wife Celia to find a way to provide for the family. To tell the truth, Chelsea didn't really like playing Yu-Gi-Oh cards, thinking they were just okay. What she really wanted was to just get out of the house and spend time with her brother, and eventually, Andrew. She also just liked to talk. She liked the hours they all spent in the booth just chatting as they played or watched as others played against each other. According to a family friend, Ruth Brewstrom, Chelsea could, quote, make friends with the devil himself, unquote. And after the events of December 11th, it appeared that she had maybe done just that. Another regular in the IHOP group was Susanna Alejandra Toledano. Susanna had recently just moved in with the Richardsons after a heated conflict with her mother. She was barely making it through school and spent most of her nights and weekends working in the fast food industry when she wasn't hanging out at IHOP. Susanna and Chelsea had been friends for years and had even spent the money to take out a page in their yearbook, filling the space with pictures of them and captions that read things like naughty and nice, smile now, cry later, and up to no good. There was also a poem written by Chelsea entitled, quote, friends are forever, end quote. Eventually, as the small card group grew closer, they started spending more and more time with each other outside of their favorite late-night pancake place. But, contrary to what might have been believed, instead of hanging out at Andrew's large and comfortable home, the crew usually found themselves hanging out on the Richardson side of town. Ray and Ruth Brewstrom were longtime family friends of the Richardson family and lived close by to them on a large piece of property in a rural part of town. There were little to no rules for the young group, and there was plenty of space for them to just be themselves. So the card group, which now even included the IHOP night manager, Hilario Cardenas, spent many hours and days at the unfinished Brewstrom home just talking and having fun. They all just were hanging out. The place was perfect, according to Andrew. He felt at home at the almost stereotypical white trash home. Confederate flags hung from the walls and junked cars sat on blocks in tall grass that eventually gave way to a small pond. Andrew loved it all. Unlike his real home, there was little to no judgment, nobody nagging him about what his plans were, what his college goals were, or what his career path looked like. They never bugged him about pushing himself, getting out of his comfort zone, or trying to constantly better him. He just wanted to chill. He just wanted to have fun and live his life. All that other stuff would fall into place eventually. He just wished his parents could be more like Ray and Ruth. He just wished they could get off his back. He had a job. It was only at the putt-putt, but a job was a job. He also had a girlfriend, and she was talking about becoming a lawyer or a nurse, and who cared if he didn't want to become an accountant? If he could just get a little breathing room, if he could finally figure out what he really wanted to do, he'd do it. He just needed time. If they really were that concerned, they could help him out, give him a little startup money so he could get things rolling, but they were just the worst. Andrew would often spend time telling anyone who would listen how much he hated his family. He hated his parents, he hated his sister, he hated how they acted towards him, how they treated him, and how they always expected way too much. He hated how they pretended to be such shiny, happy people all the time, but always treated him like he was a second-class citizen. They just wanted to control every aspect of his life. And he was lucky. When Sarah had acted out, not done what they wanted, his parents had shipped her off to a facility. Just shipped her off to Millwood because she wouldn't listen. Just like with him, they wanted to fix her, make their kids more like them. There were other incidents, other examples made, but the theme still remained. Shape up or ship out. That was it. Chapter 4. Andrew liked to pretend that his parents were the problem. And maybe they were to an extent, but as is true with every situation, there are two sides to the story. Family friends often talked about Andrew and his impulsive and immature nature. On one occasion, during a birthday dinner, Andrew had thrown an empty bowl of queso across the restaurant after his father had refused to order another one. When specifically asked about Andrew, a neighbor had said, quote, "He's a jackass. Andrew used to always say how much he hated his dad," end quote. Another friend states that one time during a sleepover, he witnessed Andrew's father asking Andrew for an overdue video, the one they were currently watching, and instead of complying, Andrew resisted even when his father said he would bring the video right back after taking care of the fees. Seemingly inconsolable, Andrew, in a fit of rage, removed the video from the VCR and threw the tape at his father hard enough to draw blood, which it did when it hit him in the head. There were other conflicts, other confrontations, even to the point where authorities were called in, but no arrests were ever made. The Wamsley home was not the only place where Andrew's confronting nature came to the surface. A fellow employee of Andrew's also had a lot to say about his former co-worker. Quote, "He's kind of a jerk actually, very arrogant. He thought highly of himself. He was one of those managers that nobody wanted to work on his shift." End quote. By the fall of 2003, Andrew had had enough keeping up appearances for his family. he was going to live his own life. Step 1. Drop out of college. He had barely been going anyways and had only been going to try to make his parents happy, so he was done. Like he had expected, he was cut off by his parents, who no longer would be paying for any of his bills or giving him any more of their money. This is when he started to spend more and more time with the Richardson family, even moving into the home that was described as filthy and infested with cockroaches. Andrew also started spending even more time at the IHOP, where the group continued to play their card games and commiserate with each other. Eventually, their talk of cards and strategy and their hate for their parents shifted into something darker. They started talking about how they could make all their problems just disappear. They started talking about a way they could make some money and set themselves up for the rest of their lives. The plans were simple at first: sabotage a few vehicles, they could maybe cut a few brake lines. But then, everything just seemed to escalate from there. Sunday, November 9th, 2003, 2:30 p.m. Rick Wamsley drove north on Interstate 35 with his wife Susie and daughter Sarah on their way to lunch. Chili's seemed to be the consensus, and they were taking the exit to the closest one when a loud metallic twang echoed through the cabin of the family's Jeep. Rick was alert now, checking all his gauges and hyper-focused on any feedback he could get from the moving vehicle. Was it just a rock? Had he lost a belt? He made it the rest of the way to the restaurant parking lot, where he was able to exit the vehicle and see if there was any apparent damage. That's when he first saw the bullet hole. They called the police, filed a report, and a detective was sent to talk to the family about the incident. Rick recapped the story, mentioning that a white Mustang, almost identical to his son's, had been passing his Jeep when he heard the loud noise. But it wasn't the only car on the road, so he just couldn't be sure that that was the Mustang that had actually shot at him. According to Sarah Wamsley, after the detective left, her mother, Susie, immediately called Andrew to ask him where he was. She then stated that her parents refused to even talk about the incident ever again. With no evidence and a refusal to move forward from the Wamsleys, there were no arrests, and the incident was just chalked up to a random event. Chapter 5. Andrew Wamsley couldn't believe it. He was sure, no, positive, that the car would explode if they shot it in the gas tank. They must have missed. Just his luck. He finally builds up enough courage to take out his parents, and he screws it up. But not again. This time he's going to make sure that it happens. The money, the precious house, everything his father cared about so much, it would soon be his. December 11th, 2003, approximately 3 a.m. The crew was assembled: Suzanna, Chelsea, and Andrew. Pulling up to the Wamsley's family home, Andrew opened the garage door, knowing that the door inside, the one to the house, would be unlocked. The rest of the group watched anxiously as the section door slowly rolled up into the garage's ceiling. They worried about the noise, about someone seeing them, but the early morning found the quiet neighborhood peaceful, empty, and almost dead. Carefully, the three intruders entered the home. They began to make their way to the master bedroom, but stopped when they found Susie Wamsley, Andrew's mother, asleep on the couch, a blanket thrown over her to keep her warm on the cold December night. The three dark figures stood shrouded in shadow, as they frantically motioned at each other using a strange form of sign language in an attempt to silently convey to each other what they should do next. Finally, seeming to come to some sort of strange consensus, one of the dark figures raised their hand once again, but this time it held a gun. Suzanna Toledano carefully aimed and fired, striking Susie Wamsley's sleeping form in the head, right near her left ear. She was dead in an instant. The sharp crack of the gun seemed to send everyone into motion. They began to move deeper into the house, heading for the master bedroom. Upon their arrival, they were met with the half-dressed Rick Wamsley, who had been awakened from sleep but was still lying in his bed. The figure with the gun once again raised it and fired, missing Rick twice before hitting him in the head. But then in a panic, Rick lunged forward, half trying to defend himself, half trying to escape. He made it past the intruders and all the way to the living room before he was shot once again, this time in the back. Rick goes down. He tried to get up, fell, then tried again. Success. He is surrounded again and begins wildly swinging, hitting anything and everything he can, and that's when the knives came out. The fight continued, Rick desperately struggling against 3 different intruders, who only kept stabbing and stabbing. He is almost able to grab one of them, but his hand slips off the small figure's head as he falls to the floor. Finally, with multiple gunshot wounds and 21 stab wounds, Rick succumbs to his injuries, dying in the entryway of his own home. After the fight with Rick, the group wonders if the single gunshot to Susie's head was actually enough to kill the woman. So, they return to where her body still lay on the couch. In order to make sure she was dead, she is stabbed multiple times as well. It is suspected that Rick and Susie Wamsley were murdered in the early hours of December 11th, but the 911 call placed from their home didn't come until that night. Most likely impatient for someone to find his parents' body, Andrew and the 2 girls returned to the home where he called 911 and then leaves, leaving the line open and his prints on the handpiece. Not long after placing the call, officers arrive and find the gruesome scene. They find the blood, the bodies, and the phone still off the hook. Just one more mess made by Andrew Wamsley that he, like always, has no intention of ever cleaning up. Chapter 6. Family First. Sarah's ex-husband, Todd Cleveland, a man who she was in a custody battle with, was the first to be brought in. But he is able to provide detectives with a rock-solid alibi. Then the children themselves were looked at. There was the house, $100,000 in cash, and a $1 million life insurance payout to consider. Still trying to tie the murders to the custody battle, Sarah was brought in because it was believed that maybe she had killed her parents in order to get more money for all of her growing legal fees. But she informs police that her parents were already paying all of her fees, and as far as she knew, they were going to continue to do so before they were murdered. When asked where she was during the time leading up to the murders, Sarah admits that yes, she was at her parents' on December 10th when she picked up her daughter after they babysat her while she was at work. She says that night, they all ate dinner together, played some games, and then she left. She woke up the next morning, leaving her house at 7:15, and dropped off her daughter with her ex and went to work. That night, the night of the murders, a co-worker of hers stayed at her house, and at 4:30 that morning, she had been woken up by police who informed her her parents had been killed. At the end of the interview, she gave investigators her DNA, then left. Next, Andrew and his girlfriend Chelsea were brought in for questioning. They both told detectives that they hadn't seen or spoken to Rick or Susie since 2 days before the murder, when they talked to them about going on a camping trip. When asked what they were doing the night of the murder, the couple spouted off a story about a date night with a round of putt-putt, a movie, and a trip to a Waffle House with friends, but when pressed, they couldn't actually provide a solid alibi. Authorities then asked Andrew if he would be okay with them searching his car. He says okay at first, but quickly changes his mind, and officers are forced to impound the vehicle in order to make their search. Evidence of a large amount of blood was found, mostly in the back passenger seat, and cuttings from the seats were sent off to be analyzed in a lab. The police then asked Andrew and Chelsea if they would be comfortable providing DNA samples, and both refused. Apparently, they were done cooperating. Then, in January of 2004, subpoenas were issued to 8 different people thought to be connected to the case to provide DNA samples. Included in those 8 were Andrew, Chelsea, and Chelsea's roommate, Suzanna Toledano. It was almost immediately noted that the hairs collected from Suzanna matched the color of the hair recovered from the crime scene. Most importantly, they matched the hairs recovered from Rick Wamsley's clenched fist. As he had fought, as he had struggled, he had tried to grab one of his attackers, but all he could get was a few strands of hair. Hair that looked a lot like the roommate of his son's girlfriend. As police waited on the results of the DNA comparisons, Andrew and Chelsea spent the entire month of February at the Brewstrom's property. They seemed relatively normal, according to the Brewstroms. They seemed like they were worried about the case, but not in a way that would indicate that they were the ones who had actually committed the gruesome murders. Ruth tried to get Andrew to open up, tried to get him to talk about how he felt about the murder of both his parents, but according to her, he would only talk to Chelsea when it came to anything related to his family. Quote, "To me, he seemed like he was in denial, in shock, but he would only talk to Chelsea. She said he would talk and cry at night about his parents." End quote. For a while, life moved on. Andrew cooked for the family while Chelsea did the dishes and helped out with the kids. They daydreamed about the future, their plans, and talked about the trips they would take as soon as the investigation was over. They even talked about marriage. But as the days passed, the stress was clearly getting to Andrew and Chelsea. Andrew began to enter into long periods of silence. He would avoid people, even Chelsea, and his behavior started to stress Chelsea out. Soon they began to argue repeatedly, and some of their shouting matches even became physical. It eventually got to the point where they were both asked to leave. With nowhere else to go, they moved back to Chelsea's parents' home. Andrew had been hoping to get his parents' money as soon as he could. According to one detective, a Detective Standifer, quote, "He was so focused on getting the money aspect, the longer it dragged on, he realized he wasn't going to get his money. I think he had a really skewed concept of how that happened. Like your parents are deceased and then the next week you get a check." End quote. And as the months went on, Andrew was getting less and less patient until, in March of 2004, the worst thing that he could think of happened. His sister Sarah had filed a lawsuit blocking her brother from collecting their father's life insurance as well as other funds. She alleged that her brother, quote, "was the principal or an accomplice in willfully bringing about the death," unquote, of Rick Wamsley. Her request was granted. On March 10th, 2004, Andrew gave a deposition in the probate case where he pled the Fifth, refusing to incriminate himself under oath. Because of this, the entire proceeding only lasted 4 minutes. One day later, on March 11th, Sarah's lawyer filed a letter from Detective Barbara Slayton Bell with the Texas Attorney General. Quote, "During the course of the investigation, suspects were identified to include both Sarah and Andrew Wamsley, victim's daughter and son. Sarah Wamsley has cooperated with the Mansfield Police Department's investigation in every way and was subsequently eliminated as a suspect. Evidence obtained during the investigation is vast and substantial, however, at this time, not able to produce probable cause. Considerable reasonable suspicion surrounds Andrew Wamsley as a suspect in the case, and as such, should not be considered for any type of benefit from the deaths of his parents, Rick and Suzanna Wamsley." End quote. March 30th, 2004. DNA tests come back on the hair found in Rick Wamsley's clenched fist. It was a match to Suzanna Toledano. Police then attempt to locate Suzanna in order to arrest her, but she is nowhere to be found. Chapter 7. Suzanna Toledano had not only skipped town, but had left the state. Looking at her cell phone records, detectives realized that she had a Chicago area code and contact Chicago PD about possibly looking into if she was anywhere in the area. On April 4th, 2004, using cell towers to triangulate her position, she was finally taken into custody after hiding at her uncle's home in the nearby city of Addison, Illinois. After her arrest, when she is confronted with a possible death penalty situation, Suzanna was more than happy to talk, and the very first person she told investigators about was Hilario Cardenas. At the time, the evening IHOP manager hadn't even been under suspicion by police, but Suzanna told officers that not only had he discussed the murder with them during some of their late-night trips, but he was actually the one who provided the gun that they had used during not only the actual murders, but the attempted murders on the freeway as well. Hilario was immediately arrested and charged. Next, Suzanna began telling officers about Andrew and Chelsea. She told them everything: the planning, the late-night conversations, and the motive. Andrew really wanted his parents' money, and he was more than happy to share it with anyone who helped him get it. He promised everyone in the group a cut as long as they not only helped, but kept their mouths shut. 3 days after Suzanna Toledano's arrest, on April 7th, 2004, Andrew Wamsley and Chelsea Richardson were arrested in the parking lot of a Chicken Express located near Chelsea's home. They were both brought in on murder charges. Because Andrew and Chelsea had lived there for a brief period, a search warrant was issued for the Brewstrom home as well as the surrounding property, and officers from multiple different agencies showed up to search. FBI, Mansfield Police, Texas Rangers, and even local firefighters from 4 different departments searched the entire property and even drained their pond in order to search for any possible evidence. At the bottom of the pond, in the mud and muck, bullets were recovered. Bullets that were matched to the rounds collected from not only the murder scene, but the drive-by shooting on the freeway as well. Investigators also learned that the blood samples that had been taken from Andrew's Mustang had come back. They were a match to both Rick and Susie. With all the suspects now safely in custody and a growing pile of evidence, investigators began to question the 4 arrested individuals about the murders. First up was Hilario Cardenas. At first, he tried to say that he didn't even know that the Wamsleys were dead. Next, he started in on a story, one that painted him as an innocent bystander, but the problem was, as officers continued to ask him questions, his story began to change, to evolve to fit the questions. He tried to paint himself as a family man, someone who was too busy working 12-hour shifts and taking care of his family to help plan a murder. He just wanted to fit in. It was all just talk. He didn't really mean it. He thought all the murder joking was that, a joke, a fantasy. They were all just friends. And yes, it was true that Andrew had asked him to get a gun, and yes, he had bought him one right before last Halloween, but when they had asked him if he could ever shoot someone, he said no. In fact, he'd even started to distance himself from the group at that time. He traded shifts, came up with excuses. He'd made a mistake, but he never expected anyone to get hurt. He never expected this. I mean, they had stopped talking to him. They were no longer a part of his life. In fact, nobody was a part of his life. He'd recently been arrested for possession of marijuana as well as unlawful carrying of a weapon, and because he'd lost his job and because of everything that was going on, his wife had even left him. He just had nothing left. He'd give them whatever they needed. With multiple witnesses ready to testify against Andrew and Chelsea, the trials began. The charges? Capital murder for both Chelsea Richardson and Andrew Wamsley. Chelsea's trial began in May of 2005. Under oath, Suzanna Toledano testified that she, Andrew Wamsley, and Chelsea Richardson murdered Rick and Suzanna Wamsley in the morning of December 11th, 2003. She also testified that Andrew and Chelsea had wanted to kill Andrew's parents in order to receive the money from the $1 million life insurance policy that covered Andrew's father. She also stated to the jury they promised her a cut if she'd help them. When asked if she had any contact with Chelsea since they both had been arrested, she replied, yes. In fact, Chelsea had written a letter to Suzanna, and in that letter, she claimed that she was pregnant and she begged Suzanna to lie to clear her name, but Suzanna knew the truth. Chelsea wasn't pregnant, and she also knew that, like before, she was once again trying to use her for her own gain. She also testified that there were a total of 3 attempts on Rick and Susie, not just 2. There had been another night, another murder planned, a home invasion that was called off at the last minute. Next, Chelsea Richardson's cellmates testified at her trial that she had openly admitted to them that, yes, she did participate in the murders. Other evidence was presented and more testimony was heard, and after only 3 hours of deliberation, Chelsea Richardson was convicted of capital murder. Then it came time for the jury to decide on the sentence: life in prison or death. The jury deliberated for 2 hours before unanimously sentencing her to death by lethal injection. She was the first female sentenced to death in Tarrant County, Texas. In January of 2012, Chelsea's death sentence was commuted to life in prison. Andrew Wamsley also went on trial in 2006, and his trial went a lot like his girlfriend's, except for one thing. His jury decided against the death penalty and only gave him a life sentence. His attorneys were able to sway the jury, convincing them that Chelsea Richardson was the real mastermind, that she was the one who drove the conversations about murder. They portrayed her as a girl who grew up with very little and had finally found a way out of the squalor, a way into a large house, a fancy car, everything that her boyfriend had grown up with and took for granted. They painted a picture of an impressionable young man who had been taken in and manipulated until he did whatever he was told. And that tale, that story, true or not, doesn't matter because it worked. And if Andrew plays his cards right, he will be eligible for parole in the year 2044. He will be 60 years old. Because of her plea deal, Suzanna Toledano pled guilty to murder, and on May 26, 2006, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Hilario Cardenas also pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, and on May 26, 2006, he was sentenced to 50 years with the possibility of parole. In the end, it was all just a game of he said, she said. The evidence just wasn't enough to say who exactly did what and how, but the way Andrew treated his parents made it all that much more believable. Maybe if he'd listened to his parents instead of trying to take everything they had worked hard for, things and money that they actually freely gave to him when he was making his strides to better himself, then he probably wouldn't be spending over half of his life behind bars. Maybe he would be an upstanding family man like his father. Maybe he would be a kind and helpful neighbor like his mother. Or maybe he wouldn't be either of those things. Instead, a spoiled, ungrateful boy who had always looked for the easy way out, the codependent coward named Andrew Wamsley. And that's it. This has been the last episode of Season 1 of Almost Fiction. Join me next time as we kick off a new season and cover even more cases and true crime stories. I want to thank everyone who has taken the time to listen, and especially those who have taken time to rate and review. I also want to thank everyone who supports the show at 1159plus.com, where subscribers can get new episodes early, ad-free, and receive access to bonus episodes of Almost Fiction as well. And starting today, there is a new $5 tier for those of you who want to support just Almost Fiction. And for your $5, you will get early, ad-free access to the show, as well as access to all episodes of Almost Fiction Plus, our bonus episodes. So, head on over to almostfiction.supercast.com to take advantage of our newest offer. You can also join us over on Facebook. There you can check out the posters specifically created for each new episode. Just search for Almost Fiction Podcast and join the group. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for all you do. And as always, I'm Chase Ellerman, and this is Almost Fiction.